will have the chance to listen to Emily BURCHFIELD, who comes from, for us in Reims, directly from the United States. Well, she's in Europe not only for us and not only in Reims, but still it's a great chance to have her with us. Emily is an assistant professor in the environmental department at Emory University in Atlanta in the US. She's the leader of the FACES lab, where she studies with her colleague the interactions between food systems, agriculture, climate, and the environment. She does an interdisciplinary work, integrating big geospatial data with deep qualitative and survey data. Emily is currently doing sabbatical research in Belgium at UC Louvain, and she will speak about challenges in the agricultural systems, and will interrogate the way, as researchers, how we can support a transition to sustainability. So, Emily, the floor is yours.
Je voulais juste clarifier que je ne suis pas venue depuis les États-Unis en avion pour être ici. Hein. Je suis venue en voiture depuis la Belgique, donc ça va. OK. English? So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work in our lab and a new project that's just started. So we're kind of in beta phase, figuring out how to do this. And so what I'm really excited about today is to honestly get some feedback and hopefully good questions from you guys. Just out of curiosity to know who's in the room, and I hate making this distinction, but I'm going to, who feels like they align more with the social sciences? Small but mighty team of 3 people. So everyone else kind of aligns more with the natural sciences. Who's studying the sort of agricultural space, also out of curiosity? There's some people. All right, well, this might be interesting to you guys. And the rest of you, I got some emojis and stuff that are going to pop up. It'll be fun. Okay, so I loved the title of this workshop, Transdisciplinary Research for a Healthy Planet. That's certainly where we're trying to be as a lab, but I think, you know, in my mind, maybe more of you will start studying agriculture after you see some of these statistics, but half of the world's habitable land, half is used for agriculture, production of food, fuel, and fiber. This makes agriculture the largest biome, and I'm using that word intentionally, on the planet. In my country, half of our land is used to make food, fuel, and fiber, and 80% of that land is 5 things: corn, soy, wheat, hay, alfalfa. Most of that feeds animals. The US has seen some of the most radical landscape transitions on Earth in the last 150 years. Here in the EU, ag covers 39% of land area. It's a big source of greenhouse gases, especially methane. And in France, field crops, again, pretty typically grown at large scale in fairly simplified contexts, are over 45% of what you guys grow. And I learned today, particularly in this region of France. So I think this isn't news to anybody, but I'm going to present this as both what agriculture has done in the last century, but also as the problem statement from which I'm going to start this talk. Globally, but certainly in your home and in my home, agricultural landscapes are more productive than ever before. This is a good thing. They're more efficient than ever before, though the asterisks indicate there's buckets of research showing that these combined effects of declining soil quality, climate change, and just diminishing returns to technological the efficiency gains we're seeing in the ag sector, we're really seeing plateaus in terms of production, particularly in very productive parts of the world. And efficiency, you know, you could think about how you define efficiency and come to a very different conclusion. Systems in our countries are increasingly specialized with entire landscapes dedicated to 1 or 2 plants. So simplified as well. In the US, we've seen a radical scaling up of agriculture. I'll show you some data showing that in a minute. And increasingly capital intensive. So this makes it hard for experimentation, innovation, diversity to break through. There's wild lock-in in these systems. And the problem statement for our team and for many researchers around the world is how do we create change, maybe a bit of ex-novation as well, in these huge systems that have tremendous technological lock-in. All right. Oh, and then I'll just add this. How are the people who grow our food doing? Anybody been in Paris or Brussels in the last month? This is like last week in Brussels. My favorite one is this guy who is shooting milk at police officers. I thought that was a win. But so people are not good. And the same stuff is happening in the US. This is right now in your home. And here's some quotes I took from the Belgian press that I thought did a pretty good job of summarizing some of the sentiments. It's kind of farmers bearing the consequences of the Green Revolution. This lock-in and this sort of innovation moment that had tremendous consequences for people all around the world. This is Wallonian data, but you've got farmers, it's the same in the US. It's one of the hardest jobs on the planet. They work long hours, they make no money. Much of the value from agricultural production is sucked up by the folks that sell the inputs to production and the folks that distribute the product from the farm to you. So don't go to Deleuze, huh? Go somewhere else. Oh, Deleuze is Belgian, isn't it? What is it here? I forget. Carrefour, don't go there. Okay, and then yeah, the PAC is a complicated piece of policy. In the US, we have the Farm Bill. It's hard for farmers to navigate all of the bureaucracy and rules embedded in that policy that are ever-changing and hard for farmers who are trying to do good work. We have these same problems in the US. Here's where we are. We're pretty bad in the US, but y'all knew that already. I'm talking about US farming. We're kind of creating the paradigm that's creating the problems. But one of the things we've been looking at in our lab is farm livelihoods. In the United States, the median income is negative for farmers. I don't know if you guys knew that. I didn't know that until I did this research. What I'm showing you here on the left, these are US counties. And the color is the income. If it's red, it's negative. On the left, you're in 1969. And the right, you're a couple years ago. This is net farm income. This is the money farmers take home after they sell their products, they pay for expenses. And what's really shocking is it accounts for the billions of dollars in federal subsidies we give to farmers every year. So this is a problem. Ag is broken. We got to fix it. How do we fix it? This is kind of how I think about when I'm talking with farmers or just folks working in the ag space, particularly in the US. I didn't even mention all of these other challenges that farmers face or the ag sector faces. You have ecological degradation, a whole suite of negative externalities associated with agricultural production. A lot of what we're studying in my lab are the impacts of climate change on how and where we grow food. Farm workers, labor rights, massive exploitation in our food sector here and in the US and beyond. High food prices, we're still facing high food prices despite the fact that farmers are making no money. There's tremendous food insecurity. And we could have a whole other conversation about the implications of the agricultural paradigm that's emerged in the US and Europe for farmers in the global South. So we have a problem, but I often have kind of this impression that we're sitting in a room on fire just being like, it's cool, we're good, we'll just keep doing this. And so thinking about this combined idea of really ex-novation, it's inspiring to me about phasing out certain modes of production while phasing in new ways of growing and supporting farmers in that process, because if you remember one thing from this talk, farming is hard. It's really hard. Okay. So here's my, this is what was the take-home message on the earlier slides this morning? This is my take-home message. We know this major transition is necessary, and I would say inevitable, and I think in Tom's talk you heard that too, the change is gonna come whether or not we want it to, and so how do we manage it in an intentional way? Where do we want to move towards? I think that conversation's not being had enough, so I'm gonna talk about it a bit today. Given the mess we're in, how do we get there, wherever it is we want to move towards? And then I think crucially for this community, what's our role as researchers? How do we participate? I don't think just publishing academic papers is enough anymore. There's too much at stake. So how do we do that? I'm talking about agriculture, but hopefully this way we're thinking about this problem of transition can motivate you to think about these same this process I'm going to present and these same questions in other types of systems. So this is a very dense slide. I'm sorry, just focus on the left first. Ignore the words for now. I didn't make this figure. There's a really cool team. I'm putting the paper down here. That made this. We've been trying to get this grant for years, and NSF that's our big national science foundation that funds a lot of research in the US, wasn't buying it until Biden became president, and then we could talk about climate change again. But what we're trying to do as a team is think about what climate change means for food systems, really for agricultural landscapes in the United States. We're trying to understand how changing climate will change where and how we grow food. That's really the question, but what we're interested in as well are these big questions about transition towards something better and understanding what better looks like and what it could be. So we found this paper and we found this figure that we really loved, where it proposed this approach of really examining, these are complex, messy systems, food systems, agricultural landscapes. There's a million things interacting to shape the outcome we're interested in of a particular crop being grown in a particular place. So it's kind of a methodological approach, a framework of really looking closely at a system, what's happening there, studying historical dynamics, understanding lock-in and path dependency. Working with a combination in this project of big data, predictive modeling, machine learning to understand what could be, but also working with stakeholders to understand what could be, what's likely. But I think the most important part of the whole project is step 3, really taking time to think about what should be, to have a normative moment. Even as scientists, I think we're allowed to do that. What do we want? What are desired futures? How do we get there? And this last piece is going to be very hard, but moving from that articulation of a destination, moving towards it, identifying transition pathways that can get us to where we want to go. And that's hard. So I'm going to talk about, let me actually tell you the research questions on the right. We kind of mapped our research questions onto this broader conceptual framework about how we might think about doing research about transition. So we're examining land use change. We're predicting how land use has been managed historically. We're projecting how land use will change using big quantitative models, but also by engaging stakeholders. So I'll talk about that. For number 3, we're engaging farmers over and over and over again, and other stakeholders too, to try and understand what they want and the differences in what's desired across different groups. And then thinking about what changes need to be made to get to these futures. And so, yeah, it's messy research, but it's kind of fun and hopefully matters. Where are we doing this? We have someone from Iowa in the room, ladies and gentlemen, right there. Iowa, is it fair to say it's the most altered landscape on Earth? Yeah. 99.7% corn and soy. Has anyone ever been to the middle of the United States? I'm sure people have been, it's like New York, California, everyone misses the middle. It's really shocking. It's 2 plants for miles and miles. A day of driving, and you got corn and soy. So it is truly, I think, one of the most altered landscapes on Earth. That's Iowa. We're also working in Ohio, which is up there, which is kind of slightly more diverse, still very dominated by corn and soy. And then I live in Georgia, down in the southern part of the United States. You can't study agriculture in the South without thinking about race and slavery. We have tremendous legacies of slavery still in the South, and it shapes who grows and what's grown and how it's grown. So it's a part of what we're thinking about in that state. It's also surprisingly diverse. There's a lot of things grown in my state, and so we kind of have these 3 different case studies where we're trying to look at these transition pathways and understanding land use change. So now you know where we're working, and if you have questions about Iowa, we have an expert. Here's what we're thinking about. We're trying to model cultivation geographies. That's fancy language to say, like, what's grown where and why. Cultivation geographies are a function of course, sun, soil, and water. That's what defines where you can grow different plants. But for literally since the dawn of agriculture, I mean, agriculture is defined by humans pushing up against those biophysical limits to grow different things. And understanding these dynamics, all the messy people stuff, is absolutely essential to modeling how agricultural systems will change in the future. But it's really hard. It's really hard to anticipate how farm-level management might shift, how technologies might evolve, how political economy might shape what farmers do. You have some protests in Paris and Brussels, and all of the sort of agroecological progress that's been made at the level of the EU much of it's been axed. And so you have these huge shocks to the system that matter and that we have to try and understand, let alone household constraints, power, access, inequality, racism, where I live and everywhere, I would argue. This is a part of understanding what's grown and why it's grown. Okay, so what are we doing? How are we actually doing this? We've been modeling cultivation geographies. So I'm a data scientist. That's a lot of my work as I play with big data sets. We have really good land use data in the United States for the last 20 years. And so I've been creating these models that basically predict where crops are grown. Is a crop grown there, yes or no? And it's a function of sun, soil, and water, but a bunch of other stuff. So this is a visual tool called a variable importance plot. Basically, the size and darkness of the circles are how important something is in predicting where a crop is grown. We're looking at, again, these are the 6 crops. These are about 70% of what's grown in the US, 70 or 80. Alfalfa, corn, cotton, hay, soy, wheat. And what has been really interesting in this modeling is we're seeing that climate really drives geographies. I'm checking the time, cool. But so does, of course, input use. That makes sense. People are growing, especially these heavily incentivized crops in areas that are not that biophysically suited to their production. But if you put a lot of fertilizer on the ground, you can still grow that crop and make a profit, especially with the federal incentives for these crops. What's really interesting in the US, and I won't go into it too much, but I'm happy to talk in the Q&A, we have a federal crop insurance program. So we actually subsidize crop insurance for farmers, but only for certain crops and only at certain scales. And the main crops we subsidize are corn and soy. And so farmers grow a lot of corn and soy. If you're a maraîcher, you're doing diverse vegetable production, organic production, small scale, it's very hard to touch these programs. So it's a part of the story. And I think it's interesting as you look out at agricultural landscapes to think about the political economy that makes a landscape look that way. And in the US, it's one of prioritizing production, efficiency, and scale. And we're seeing that in the models, which is kind of cool. With these historical models, we can look into the future. We can wiggle the input variables and say, all right, when climate changes, how might these probabilities of seeing a crop in a place change? That part's kind of easy. The people stuff's hard. So again, we have really good projections of climate. We even have some projections of soil parameters into the future. We even have cool projections of irrigation, things that are hard to project, but we have some quantitative data we can use to build scenarios. This stuff's really hard, though, the people stuff. How can I anticipate political economic change, especially in my damn country, where it swings back and forth very, very quickly? I was telling someone earlier, in the Trump years, we couldn't write grants that had the word climate change in them. And so again, these are things that shape agricultural landscapes and production paradigms, and trying to anticipate them is a part of preparing farmers for future realities. So we've done the modeling work. We've used the biophysical piece to look into the future and see what that might mean for agricultural production. I think of these results as very pessimistic because they're not at all incorporating human adaptation to changing climate. So with these pessimistic results, we see corn leaving the Midwest. When I published this paper, I got an email from a farmer in Iowa who said, and I quote, "Does your mother know you were born brain dead?" Lots of profanity. And so, because it's impossible to imagine that place without this plant. But I'm not the only one finding this. Corn is moving north. Wheat is moving north. It's going to get hot. Things are going to be hard to grow. So the way, as a team, we're thinking about parameterizing the people in these models is we're using 2 different approaches. And we're at the big early days of this, so I won't have results to present, just some ideas and preliminary data. Has anyone heard of Delphi surveys before? It's new to me, and it's kind of cool. I'll explain in a second. We're doing Delphi surveys and farmer focus groups. So Delphi surveys were developed in the 50s by the RAND Corporation in the United States. It's this way of iteratively surveying experts to get them to converge on quantitative estimates of what's going to happen in the future. It's really kind of interesting, and we're not entirely sure it's going to work, but we're going to try it. The idea is you share kind of what experts are saying in iterative rounds, and in sharing, eventually, they kind of converge on some sort of parameterization of, well, if genetic modifications of corn improve in this way, we might see a 5% increase in yields, and then we can think about in our models what that means for suitability. So we're playing with this to get quantitative estimates that we can include in our projections, but quantitative misses a whole swath of nuance, of course. And so we're also doing a number of farmer focus groups in all 3 states across many different groups to try and understand things that the models absolutely can't see. First, the models can't see weird surprises because they're calibrated on historical patterns. They can't see paradigm shift, they can't see ex-innovation, they can't see, even the farm protests in Brussels. And so that's what we're trying to capture a bit with these focus groups and the Delphi work. But the other thing we're missing is all the nuance of what happens actually on a farm. I have a colleague who studies, for example, the impact of access to childcare, which is a huge problem in the US, on farm decision making. This is the kind of nuance we know our models can't catch, but it's crucially important. And so using these farmer groups as a way to kind of wrap some caution around our modeled results and explain what they do and don't do, to kind of interrogate the error and uncertainties, but using qualitative data is something we hope we'll be able to pull off. I think, again, the most important part is diving into what futures folks actually want. And we've been doing this. We've been asking farmers these wild, open-ended questions where we're just like, what's your dream for your farm? And like, what's keeping you from getting there? And it's very fun, and we're learning so much. And every farmer has a vision for their farm, of course. But there are real barriers and bridges to them achieving that. So I'll share some of the quotes because they're pretty gold. But we're also doing environmental impact assessments to think about the environmental implications of different agricultural futures to kind of give the environment a voice in this modeling effort. And we're moving, of course, beyond farmers to other food system stakeholders, and we're doing some interviews. But what we're finding, this is not news to anyone. What are the barriers to enacting on-farm visions? If you really want to talk about barriers or bridges, you have to talk about money. Farmers have vision, but they lack resources to see that vision through. Look at this. This one blew my mind. This guy grows cotton in southern Georgia. You know what a new 6-row roller Gunder cotton picker costs? $1 million. This is a big machine that harvests cotton. You cannot grow cotton unless you're growing it at massive scale. You can't play this game unless you have millions of dollars to invest. This actually stifles, I would argue, experimentation and the innovation we need to make our systems adapt to the realities we're facing. This farmer is already facing stresses from climate change, but he doesn't have a choice. Here's another thing that came up over and over again, risk. This is, again, maybe more of a US-centric conversation about crop insurance, but I think this rings true in Europe as well. This is from a small-scale organic farmer, one of our few female farmers in our state, who's talking about how easy it is for conventional row crops. So these are like the big commodities, corn, wheat, soy. Easy to get insurance. No problem, they can insure their crop because even if the crop fails, they get federal subsidies. They're guaranteed a profit. If you're growing fruits and vegetables at small scale, not the large scale sort of California production, but small scale, like maraîcher here, it's almost impossible to insure your operation. That's a huge problem. These are the people that actually grow the nutrient-rich food. The last thing is access. We, believe it or not, do actually have a whole suite of agro-environmental programs in the US. It's called EQIP. And there's lots of money, even more now under Biden, to pay farmers to adopt different agro-environmental mechanisms on farm. Are farmers doing it? No, they don't have to. The incentives aren't strong enough, especially for smaller scale farmers. The payments are something like $50 an acre, which, again, hectare, I don't know. We always use different units. But yeah, so it's not enough if you're growing on like a 20-acre vegetable farm. You're not going to go through the bureaucratic bullshit, to be quite blunt. You have to access these funds if you're growing at that scale. So what changes are required to create these transition pathways towards desirable futures? Again, we're still in beta here, figuring out how to do this, but one of the things we're most excited about in this project is we have money to bring people together to talk. People who never have a chance to talk. The organic growers in Georgia, the black growers and the white growers, the conventional growers, to all come together and get a sense of their vision for the future of the state and to map transition pathways towards that future. Just to listen to each other and to create space for people who are working tremendously long hours to have those conversations and to reflect a little bit about what they want. This is 4 years from now, so I'll come back in 4 years and let you know if it worked. I don't know. This is messy, hard stuff, but we are hoping that by bringing folks together, including the people with the power to change policy in these states, to have really hard conversations both about what not just our models, but whole suites of models have to say about the implications of climate change on food systems, means for their operations, and crucially, I think, what they want and how they can get there. So there's a lot of other things we're trying to pull off, including some public art projects and sort of elevating narrative and doing extension and policy briefings. But again, 4 years from now, but we're hoping we pull it off. We'll see. At least we'll have some cool models to share. That's not a... yeah, so again, just to kind of conclude, I think we're all on board with this. To answer the last question, which I think is the most important question for this group, where I see a lot of students and young scholars, I think there's something to this approach. I don't think it's the approach. We're muddling through and experimenting as well. But this idea about taking time to assemble what you know about a system, which you're all doing as researchers, but then to really think about likely trajectories and also desired trajectories and think about the mechanisms, the leverage points that need to be pulled to move the system in new directions. I think lastly, the thing I'd love to talk more about in the Q&A or afterwards is thinking about translation beyond our community of academics, particularly into the world of policy and maybe even art. So with that, I'll stop. I know I went long. Sorry, y'all. That always happens. Any questions are welcome. Again, this is in beta. Also, just little publicité. If anybody's finishing their PhD and looking for a postdoc and really excited about this project, we're hiring. So come talk to me afterwards. We're looking for someone to really help with the modeling and some of the focus groups. If you want to move to Atlanta, it's a cool place. So with that, I'll stop and I welcome any questions you have. En français ou en anglais, c'est comme vous voulez. Thank you. I see one in the corner.
So, any questions? Thank you very much for the presentation. This lively, got there. It's really nice.
I've had like 4 coffees, so that helps.
Yeah. It's great. Quite far away, this one, but I'll get there. Perfect.
So, hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a short question. We know today that some insurance companies don't insure anymore, like in Louisiana, some firms, because of the hurricanes and stuff. Is it the same for agriculture? And do you take this in consideration when you're modeling the evolution of crops?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess the answer is it depends. Federal crop insurance programs, there's a couple different ones. There are some programs that insure against market variability. There are also some that insure against natural disaster. And because they're federal programs, I think part of the idea is, so right now, our federal insurance is deeply and absolutely incentivizing production in places where there should not be production. For example, very, very thirsty crops in very arid places, where we're seeing, for example, on the Ogallala Aquifer in the middle of the country, that aquifer is almost dry, and people are still growing very thirsty crops because even if the crop fails in very bad drought years, they get payments from federal crop insurance. So yeah, for me, it's one of the main things I'm interested in because it's a maladaptive incentive that farmers face, and understanding how that one policy or program could change what farmers grow is, to me, the most interesting political economic question that we're looking at. And equally, I'm really interested in expanding, we're trying, but we're not doing a good job, expanding insurance programs so they can support diversity. Because right now our insurance programs insure crop by crop. And so if you're a vegetable farmer growing 20 different vegetables, you have to get a policy for each different crop. And we're trying to do better. We have a new program called the Whole Farm Revenue Program that just started, but in my state, not a single insurance provider provides it. So there's a lot of federal blah, 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 but then farmers aren't seeing the changes. So yeah, insurance is the main thing to me. That's what I'm really interested in. Great question. Iowa, I see Iowa has a question.
This is just something we're talking a lot about where I live now, and that is, how are you accounting in your models for the aging demographics of farmers?
Yeah.
Because most of the people who are functioning as farmers, I think it's true in Iowa too, are over the age of 50. The median age is in the mid-50s.
It's 65.
In Iowa. So,
in the US it's 65.
So
it's crazy.
Who's replacing them, and how is that going to look? And I think that's going to be really muddy. And I was just wondering if you're trying to address that, or is that just...
Yeah, part of our focus groups are explicitly with beginning farmers. The thing is, if in the US, and I think from what I know about Wallonia, it's comparable, farmland is incredibly expensive, especially in very productive regions like Iowa. The only way you get an Iowa farm is if you inherit it. That's it. So I think there's this huge question about how beginning farmers, who are going to be the ones cultivating as climate changes, navigate those uncertainties. So we're really trying to focus our project on engaging those populations. But what that means is we're engaging this kind of strange mix of people who've inherited farmlands, who come from farming families, who are farming, and people who are just entering farming for the first time and often managing very, very small operations, largely around urban centers, trying to sell fruit and veg to... So, I mean, Atlanta is a huge capital of urban agriculture, and most of our urban farmers are young black folks, which is not like any other city in the country. That demographic has a very different vision of what they want from farming than the folks growing cotton down in the southern part of the state. So we're trying to account for that with the focus groups. It would be, I mean, we have the data to model what it means for where a crop is seen, but I think those results would probably be a little absurd. So technically we could look at it quantitatively, but yeah, the average age of farmers in the US is 65, and we're like 98% white in a country that ain't 98% white. So yeah. It's actually a good reminder to think more about that dynamic. Yeah. No more questions. Y'all want to go?
Question myself. You were talking about the surveys that you have. I mean, how do you succeed in actually convincing those stakeholders to be part of those surveys? I mean, there's always problems of confidentiality and stuff like that. I mean, what is your, how do you...
Yeah, in the US, farmers, so already the challenge in the US is you can't talk to farmers about climate change. That's challenge one. We don't talk about climate change, we talk about changes in weather. Has it been drier than normal? So that's a whole dance we have to do. People spend their careers studying how to talk to farmers about climate change in the US. So that's challenge one. So this can't be a project about climate change when we talk to them, even if it is. To get them to engage, I mean, we have financial compensation. I will never ask for a farmer's time without paying them. So we have money baked in. It's not a lot of money, but there's, I think, $200 for every time they engage with us. We try and meet them where they are. So we go to growers' conventions to make it easy for them, kind of organizing sessions at a convention where they can come. And then crucially, what we're trying to do is give them a voice in the model construction. So we hope at the end, they will know that they played a role in building the quantitative results, in building our projections. They are inputs, crucial inputs, and even co-producers of that data. They'll understand, I hope, some of the uncertainties and complexity, but I hope also understand the process a little bit better and maybe trust a little bit more what we're trying to do instead of what they're seeing coming from our federal government, which they're very reluctant to trust. So there's this kind of secret hidden project of getting farmers to trust our science. Their science, our science, like they're included in the science. It's not we're coming and saying, take this, but build it together so that so we'll see. I mean, we've been living in these states for years. My collaborators are based in the other states, and so we have strong connections, but we tend to connect with more eco-friendly farmers, I guess I would say. So it's actually connecting with the large-scale conventional growers that is the hardest, perhaps because they're the most reluctant to think about some of these transitions we're asking about. Yeah.
And I believe as well that they're interested in changing the policies. I mean, did you encounter that the policies are different from the different states that you're...
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, states can kind of ramp up or ramp down federal policy. The federal policy defined by our Farm Bill really shapes, it's the most important policy really driving where things are grown. But for example, one great example is the state of Maryland has doubled the incentives to adopt cover cropping. And so there's a lot of cover cropping in Maryland because they've taken the federal baseline, which isn't great, and doubled it. And so we've seen this massive adoption of an environmentally friendly practice. I guess you could debate that, it's complicated. But yeah, and so the states do have some power. Right now, my state is negotiating a climate action plan. Most states are right now. There's this big climate action plan moment across most states and a lot of money to prioritize climate action. And they're thinking about transition in the agricultural sector, and it'll look different in every state. The U.S. is such a big place with very different growing paradigms that and California is another great example. They have a whole other suite of environmental incentives that other states don't have. They also have huge water issues that they're grappling with, so there is a lot of state variability, and that's part of what we're interested in comparing. Yeah, I live in a very conservative state, but in a very liberal city, and so it's part of what's interesting too. Yeah, weird dynamics.
Okay, very good.
So I saw that you mentioned extension programs in your slides a little bit, and I was wondering, what is the role of those land grant colleges in working with these farmers and small growers? Because I think a lot of small growers and home growers use those land grant college resources in order to inform some of their practices.
Do y'all know what land grants are? That's a very American thing. I think it's a cool thing about our ag system in the U.S. We have federal money that supports these land grant institutions. There's one in each state. They're paid by, they're public institutions, so they receive federal money to do research for the population of that state. These tend to be the institutions where much of the agricultural research lives. So University of Georgia in my state, Iowa State is a very famous land grant. So these are special institutions that tend to have a lot of the big agricultural programs. And what's really unique about these universities is they have positions where you have researchers whose job is not just conducting academic research or teaching. Their job is to translate research largely from that institution to the community in that state. And so extension is this thing that happens in the US where you have a lot of faculty, largely in agricultural programs, who translate the latest research to farmers in that state. They share, they promote. And mixed reviews on what extension, different farmers have really different thoughts on extension. I think farmers are also getting a lot of advice from agribusiness, and sometimes the folks from extension feel a little old school compared to the agribusiness. And there's a general distrust of universities sometimes that can be another hurdle. Those caveats aside, I think the land grant system and the extension programs that live at land grant systems are wildly important in shaping particularly plant breeding, super important. some of the varieties of like peanuts and blueberries we're using in our state that are in fact resistant to some of the changes climate change will bring were bred by researchers at University of Georgia. And so I think there's, I think it's a tremendous resource, undertapped, and I think extension hasn't been as focused on climate change as it could be, but that's changing and it has changed. So I'm optimistic about the potential of that entire army of researchers and folks to really contribute. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but extension's important. Yeah, I think it's a cool thing about the US. All right.
There are other questions maybe? We still have some time, so can be question for Tom as well from the previous presentation. So, okay, Guelph, really well presented.
How generally the farmers with the biggest voice are the ones that are actually still making money. And you showed that graph of the United States, and we see this in Canada too, that these very large-scale two-crop farmers are actually still very profitable.
Oh, yeah.
And they're the ones that have the money to lobby and voice and all that. How do we prevent Iowa from creating policy for the nation? Or I'm sure that happens here too, where there's one group of farmers who's wildly successful who creates policy for everyone to the detriment of everyone but what they're doing. So they like the status quo because they're successful.
Sounds like an ex-novation question. How do you phase out big ag and phase in something else? I actually don't think we need to phase out big ag. I think big ag's an important part of the solution. For me, I think just prices for food for fresh fruit and veg is a big step in the right direction. I'm not answering your question because I don't think I can actually. I will say, I mean, in the U.S. there's an organic lobby. It's small compared to like the dairy and beef lobby, but it's there and vocal, underfunded, but it's there. You're asking an impossible question about how to change lobbying and farm policy in the U.S. That's kind of the question. This will be a cop-out, but I'll still say it. I think what I'm thinking about more and more, to be completely blunt, is bypassing our federal system altogether and working with institutions. For example, healthcare systems, universities, to push them towards this idea of values-aligned procurement. So trying to incentivize folks with money to make decisions based on certain conceptions of justice or what's right that aligns with their values. And for example, our university's we're experimenting with it. We're trying very hard to purchase local food. It's a stated priority of our institution, and therefore we have to document that we're purchasing fruit and veg from local producers. We also care about supporting diverse producers, and we've defined what that looks like. And it's not revolutionizing the food system, right? But it is changing things in our little corner of Georgia. I'm starting to think, at least in my country, where our federal government is a bit of a mess and moves very slowly, moving through institutions, unfortunately I'm saying move through the private sector, but I think that there's a lot happening there, is a great way to support small, thriving, diverse food systems. And I could talk more. There's some really cool programs we've been trying to bake at Emory to really prioritize values-aligned procurement. One is called the Working Farms Fund that's been purchasing land around the city of Atlanta, putting it in something called a conservation easement, which means you can't ever develop the land. That decreases the value if you can't develop the land. And we're helping young farmers work that land, and Emory as an institution has agreed to buy all their produce. So there's a lot of ideas like that that are bubbling up that are way outside of federal policy, which I honestly don't see changing much anytime soon, especially if November goes like it might go. It ain't gonna change at all. But yeah, so I'm increasingly kind of looking to the private sector for some of those changes. Cop-out answer, but yeah.
Any other question? No?
I see a lot of tired students, so I feel like we can give them a break.